We continue in Daniel, and we're in Daniel chapter 8. So be turning over to that chapter, Daniel, the 8th chapter. You recall last week how that we said that Daniel is not in chronological order, the way that it is in our Bibles, because on chapter 7, you remember we got through chapter 4, we skipped to chapter 7, because chapter 7 says, in the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon. We pointed out that Nabonidus, Belshazzar's father, was a co-regent with Belshazzar for a period of time. And this was during that period of time. Belshazzar was considered a king along with Nabonidus for a period. And then Belshazzar took the throne outright for himself. Well, chapter 8 begins in the third year of Belshazzar, or the reign of King Belshazzar. That will put it about 550 BC. At the end of chapter 7, Daniel is 63 years old. Here he is about 65 years old. Here is a man who has been in a foreign land most of his life, taken by Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians to Babylonian captivity when he is around 18 to 21 years old, made a eunuch along with his three Hebrew friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. You know them better as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. All four of those boys were taken captive, and they rose to a place of prominence because of their ability and because of their charisma. And we saw, of course, how that Daniel interpreted the dream of Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 2. And then in chapter 3, how that the three friends of Daniel escaped the burning fiery furnace because God was with them. And they were elevated to a position of high prominence. In chapter 4, we then see how that Nebuchadnezzar himself is brought low because of his pride and sees the truth that there is one true God. And then that sets the stage for what we saw in chapter 7. How that Daniel sees this great vision in the first year of the reign of Belshazzar. Remember, Nebuchadnezzar passes away in the intervening time between chapter 4 and chapter 7, and how that Nabonidus then eventually comes to rule on the throne in Babylon, and Belshazzar, his son, is co-regent with him. And so here in chapter 8, we find it's the third year of the reign of King Belshazzar. Daniel is 65, and he sees another vision. A vision appeared unto me, even unto me Daniel, after that which appeared unto me at the first. He references back to the vision he had in chapter 7. The first vision he had under the reign of Nabonidus / Belshazzar. And I saw in a vision. Now this time Daniel's not asleep. This vision comes to him while he is awake. So this is going to have an even greater impact upon him. And it came to pass when I saw that I was at Shushan in the palace, which is in the province of Elam. And I saw in a vision, and I was by the river of Ulai. Now here he's describing the location where he has this vision. Apparently, he was placed there at Shushan by King Nabonidus. He is not in Babylon proper, as he was under Nebuchadnezzar's reign. He and Nebuchadnezzar had a very close relationship, remember. Nebuchadnezzar had seen something in that young boy that attracted him, that is a charisma, an ability that he thought he could use. And then in turn, Daniel saw something in Nebuchadnezzar that he thought he could change for the glory of God. That is, he saw a devotion present in Nebuchadnezzar to his gods that could be converted over to a devotion to the one true God. That mutual friendship that Nebuchadnezzar and Daniel had paid off dividends. But then after Nebuchadnezzar's death, apparently the new rulers that came in succession did not have much use for Daniel as did Nebuchadnezzar. And so they moved him out of Babylon. And so by the time you come here in chapter 8, he is in Shushan, in the palace, which is in the province of Elam. So he is in another place. He's still not out of government, as it were. He's still serving the Babylonian government, not just at as high a position as he was before. Then I lifted up mine eyes and saw, and behold, there stood before the river a ram which had 2 horns, and the 2 horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher came up last. Now this reminds us of the beast of Daniel 7, for good reason, because there's a similarity here between these 2 visions. But notice this, a ram with 2 horns, and one was higher than the other one. Now that's an unusual picture to paint, especially for this vision, but it gets better. I saw the ram pushing westward and northward and southward, so that no beast might stand before him, neither was there any that could deliver out of his hand. But he did according to his will, and became great, the King James says. The American Standard reads, he magnified himself. Now, who does this represent? This great ram with the 2 horns, one higher than the other one, pushing north, south, east, west, magnifying himself. Well, as we're going to see, this ram represents Persia in the persona of King Cyrus. Now, mark this in your Bible and turn over to Isaiah chapter 44 for a moment. Isaiah 44, verses 24 through 29. Many years before Daniel makes this prophecy, Isaiah says this in 44, 24 through 28. Thus saith the Lord, thy Redeemer, and he that formed thee from the womb. I am the Lord that maketh all things, that stretcheth forth the heavens alone, that spreadeth abroad the earth by myself, that frustrateth the tokens of the liars, and maketh diviners mad, that turneth wise men backward, and maketh their knowledge foolish, that confirmeth the word of his servant, and performeth the counsel of his messengers, that saith to Jerusalem, thou shalt be inhabited. And to the cities of Judah you shall be built, and I will raise up the decayed places thereof. That saith to the deep, be dry, and I will dry up thy rivers. That saith of Cyrus, he is my shepherd, and shall perform all my pleasure. Even saying to Jerusalem, thou shalt be built, and to the temple, thy foundation shall be laid. So we have this prophecy many, many years before Daniel ever comes on the scene. And Isaiah, through the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, specifically mentions the name of Cyrus. Now, who is this Cyrus? Cyrus is the king of Persia. But Persia hasn't even entered the scene yet. Babylon is still very much the world power that's on the world stage. But here, God is emphasizing to Daniel that this great ram is coming up. And this great ram represents Cyrus. And as I was considering verse 5, he's thinking about this. Daniel's thinking, what does this mean? Behold, an he-goat came from the west on the face of the whole earth, and touched not the ground. And the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. And he came to the ram that had 2 horns, which I had seen standing before the river, and ran unto him in the fury of his power. And I saw him come close unto the ram, and he was moved with choler against him, and smote the ram, and brake his 2 horns. And there was no power in the ram to stand before him. But he cast him down to the ground, and stamped upon him, and there was none that could deliver the ram out of his hand. Okay, so if this ram represents Persia, specifically noting Cyrus as one of the great leaders of that power, here comes this he-goat from the west. And this he-goat has a lot of fury and a lot of power with him, and he overcomes that ram. Now, who does this he-goat represent? Well, if the ram represents Persia, yeah. The he-goat would then represent Greece, the Grecian Empire, The Grecian Empire would rise up after Persia and would overcome Persia. Now, Brother Turner, and I keep on referencing his commentary, you need to have it if you don't have it. I'm not going to read it because it'd take too long. But he does a marvelous job in talking about the historical background concerning Persia and Greece and the things and the events that led to the rise of Greece and their power on the world stage. He goes through all the leaders of both Persia and then Greece in explaining this section of Daniel chapter 7. I won't go into detail. I'll just say that this section that we're reading about is really describing the rise of Alexander the Great, as we're going to see in the next couple of verses, what leads to his power on the world stage. Verse 8, therefore the he-goat waxed very great, or magnified himself exceedingly. And when he was strong, the great horn was broken. And for it came up four notable ones toward the four winds of heaven. All right, so if this represents Greece, specifically Alexander the Great, now this lines up marvelously with what we know from the historical record. Alexander the Great had a meteoric rise to power at a very young age. By the time he was 33 years old, Alexander the Great had conquered the entire known world, all the way from the west of Greece, to the very gates of India itself. And at the very zenith of his conquest, he struck down. That is to say, he dies. There are conflicting reports as to how his death. Likely it was a result of some of his excesses. Maybe it had to do with some kind of disease that he picked up while he was in the Far East with his conquering army. But for whatever reason, he struck down. And then, as a result, his empire, the Grecian Empire, is divided between his four generals, known as the Diadochi, if I can get it correct in my mind. The Diadochi. In other words, his four generals split up the empire between themselves because Alexander has a son, but it is disputed whether or not that son is the legitimate heir to the throne. And so in the resulting power vacuum, these generals step in to try to take up the slack. And that is why you see this take place in verse 8. And out of one of them came forth a little horn, which waxed exceeding great toward the south, and toward the east, and toward the pleasant, American Standard says, glorious land. So from one of these notable ones, one of these four notable ones, there comes a little horn, which waxed exceeding great. Now, who does that represent? Well, again, I defer to Rex Turner, in that he says, and I agree fully with him, that this little horn of Daniel chapter 8 is Antiochus the Fourth Epiphanes. Antiochus the Fourth Epiphanes rose up in his zeal to try to conquer all of the lands of the east and was stopped in his tracks by Rome. They literally, one of the Roman generals literally drew a circle in the sand around Antiochus the Fourth Epiphanes in a very famous meeting between Antiochus and one of the Roman generals. Drew a circle around Antiochus and said, "You're not going to advance beyond that." He says, "This represents what you have. You're not advancing any further." And Antiochus knew that Rome could back up what they said. And so as a result, in his anger, Antiochus, when he's going back to Syria, makes a stop in Jerusalem. He despised the Jews and despised the glorious land exceedingly. And as a result of that anger, he orders that a pig be offered up on the altar there in Jerusalem. And not only that, that an image be placed within the temple. Most people think it was an image of himself, and that he ordered all of the Jews to bow down to that image. And so, when you're going to read later about the abomination of desolation that standeth in the holy place, that's what it refers to. That is, this image that Antiochus ordered to be put into the temple. Now that would lead eventually to the Maccabean revolt. Judas Maccabeus and his brothers rise up against the Syrians. Of course, it all started when Judas's father, who is ailing, rose up and killed the Syrian that tried to enforce emperor worship, or tried to enforce worship of Antiochus. Well, that lit the match to the rebellion that took place. And eventually, the Israelites took control of their own land again under the leadership of Judas Maccabeus and all of his brothers. So at any rate, this is talking about all that leads up to this. And so this little horn, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, and by the way, Epiphanes means glorious one. Well, the Jews, when they're penchant toward a sarcastic humor, a dry humor at that, called him Antiochus IV Epimanes. Epimanes means madman. They called him the madman. And indeed, he was just that. But notice verse 10. It waxed great, even to the host of heaven. And it cast down some of the host and of the stars to the ground and stamped upon them. Now this is, for lack of a better term, apocalyptic language. That is to say, this is descriptive language talking about something else. Obviously talking about he-goats and horns and what have you. This represents something. And he's going to talk about what it represents later on in this chapter. But here when he says, this little horn waxed great even to the host of heaven, there is a difference of opinion among scholars as to who the host of heaven represent. Does it represent angels? Well, host of heaven can refer to angels on occasion. But again, guess what? I defer to Brother Turner's judgment. Brother Turner says, and I agree with him, that this refers to the saints, that is, the Jewish saints. That is to say, Antiochus the fourth Epiphanes would cast down some of the host and of the stars to the ground and stamp upon them. All that we know about Antiochus in his campaign back through Palestine, when he has turned back from Egypt, when he went back through Palestine, he just wreaked havoc upon Jerusalem specifically, and upon the Israelites in particular. So this would very well represent what Antiochus would do toward the people of God. Yea, verse 11, he magnified himself even to the prince of the host, and by him the daily sacrifice was taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. Again, well describing what would happen when Antiochus would come back through Jerusalem. He would indeed magnify himself against the high priest. He would magnify himself against the worship of God. And a host was given him against the daily sacrifice by reason of transgression. And it cast down the truth to the ground, and it practiced, the King James says. The American Standard says it did its pleasure and prospered. Very interesting. I want to read a little bit of what Brother Turner says here, because he doesn't have a lot to say about verse 12, but a very significant thing indeed. Here in chapter 8, if I can get over to it and get to the right place. It would help if you went to the right source and the right verse. So we come back over to where it's supposed to be. There it is. All right. Now I've got it. He says, no mere man could take that continual burnt offering away from God or the Lord. But Antiochus IV Epiphanes did take away the continual burnt offering from the high priest, who was the representative of Jehovah. One thing seems to be certain. Antiochus IV Epiphanes did not cast Jehovah down to the ground, But the case is that he did replace the high priest, Onias III, through the means of his brother Jason. This Jason, brother of Onias III, approached Antiochus and promised to pay Antiochus a larger tribute than his brother was paying if Antiochus would appoint him high priest in the place of his brother Onias. And so it was that Antiochus did appoint Jason high priest in the place of his brother Onias. Well, what we know about what happened after that is the case that the Jews eventually were led into rebellion. Some quotations from the book of 1 Maccabees relative to the lawless course of Antiochus IV describes how crazy this man was. Quote, "There came forth out of them Antiochus Epiphanes, son of Antiochus the king, and he entered into Egypt with a great multitude. And he made war against Ptolemy, king of Egypt. And Antiochus, after that he had smitten Egypt, went up against Israel and Jerusalem with a great multitude, and entered presumptuously into the sanctuary, and took the golden altar and the candlestick of the light, and all that pertained thereto, and the table of the showbread. And after 2 full years the king sent a chief collector of tribute, and he spake words of peace unto them in subtlety. And he fell upon the city suddenly, and smote it very sore, and destroyed much people out of Israel. And he took the spoils of the city, and pulled down the houses thereof. And on the 15th day of Chislev, they builded an abomination of desolation upon the altar. And in the cities of Judah on every side they built idol altars. They sacrificed upon the idol altar, which was upon the altar of God. And the women that had circumcised their children they put to death. And they hanged their babes around their necks, and destroyed their houses, and them that had circumcised them. And many in Israel were fully resolved to confirm themselves not to eat unclean things. And they chose to die that they might not profane the holy covenant. And they died. It was indeed a reckless slaughter. It was more horrific than anything the Israelites had seen up to that point. And so what he describes here, verses 11 and 12, concerning Antiochus is very, very appropriate. Verse 13 says, "Then I heard one saint speaking." Now this saint would be an angel. "And another saint said unto that certain saint which spake, How long shall be the vision concerning the daily sacrifice, and the transgression of desolation, to give both the sanctuary and the host to be trodden underfoot?" In other words, how much time is going to intervene before the evening and the morning sacrifices will be restored? If all of this is going to happen, how long is it going to be before it is restored? And he said unto me, Unto 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. 2,300 days. The American Standard says evenings and mornings. Now the offering was made each morning and each evening. From the beginning of creation, Genesis 1:5 says there was evening and there was morning. The background requirement for the continual burnt offering is given in Exodus 29:38 through 42. That continual sacrifice offering had lasted with the nation of Israel throughout the centuries. Those who interpret the evening being a day and the morning as being another day are set on harmonizing the 2,300 mornings and evenings with the entire period of time that Antiochus IV was in Judea. Granted, Antiochus was in Judea over a period of some 6 years, but this time his time there, that is, was not continuous. Antiochus made 2 invasions of Palestine. Antiochus returned to Syria. He had long been ambitious to merge his country with Egypt. He had already invaded Egypt by one means and another on 3 occasions. On his 4th invasion of Egypt, certain representatives from Rome approached and announced, "You're not taking Egypt." He commented to the effect that he would consider it. Immediately, those representatives from Rome drew a circle around him, and they demanded that he promise to evacuate Egypt before he left that circle. Well, he was forced. He had to leave Egypt. As he moved through Palestine on his way to Syria, he detached 22,000 men under the command of Apollonius and sent them to Jerusalem to destroy it. According to Josephus, he obtained possession of the city of Jerusalem, that is Antiochus, through those of his own party. He vandalized the temple and left it bare. He forbade the Jews to offer daily sacrifices. He burnt down the finest buildings. He built a citadel, a fortress, in the lower part of the city where the wicked Jews dwelt. He built an altar, an idol upon God's altar. He slew pigs and offered them around upon the altar. He compelled the Jews to forsake the Jewish order of worship. He compelled the Jews to raise idol altars in every city and offer pigs on them every day. He forbade the Jews from circumcising their sons. He caused to be whipped with rods and torn to pieces those who did not adhere to his instructions. He strangled the women and the sons whom they circumcised, and he destroyed all the sacred books of the laws they were found. Now, does that tell you about the character or lack of it of this man? Then came Eleazar, who was a scribe well stricken in years. He's about 80 years of old, who with his 5 sons rebelled. Thus, of course, beginning the Maccabean revolt. Now, the point in all of this is simply this. The temple worship, including the evening and morning sacrifices, covered a 3-year period. 2,300 evenings and mornings, or 1,150 days. Now that point is very important to make as we move forward here. Verse 15. And it came to pass when I, even I, Daniel, had seen the vision and sought for the meaning. Daniel's still grappling with this. What does all this mean? Then behold, there stood before me as the appearance of a man. And I heard a man's voice between the banks of Uli, which called and said, Gabriel, make this man to understand the vision. Do you recognize that name? Gabriel. He's an archangel. One of the only, from as far as I can remember, only 2 archangels that are named specifically in the entire Bible. Gabriel's one, Michael is the other. So here is Gabriel mentioned. So he, that is Gabriel, came near where I stood. And when he came, I was afraid and fell upon my face. But he said unto me, Understand, O Son of Man, for at the time of the end shall be the vision. Or the vision belongeth to the time of the end. Now, does this represent the end of time? No. Now, our premillennial friends would raise a point of order. Oh, yes, it does. Time of the end has to be the end of time. No. Our 80-70 friends would say, oh, no. It represents the destruction of Jerusalem in 80-70 by the Romans. No. Keep it in context. What's he talking about? He's talking about Antiochus IV Epiphanes and his destruction or attempted destruction of the Jewish order of worship and of the temple and of the city. So this represents the end of the rebellion of Antiochus against the Jews. Verse 18. Now as he was speaking with me, I was in a deep sleep on my face toward the ground. It's overwhelming to Daniel. He's 65 years old and he has this overwhelming vision. It just completely overwhelms him and he's asleep. But he touched me and set me upright. This whole thing has drained Daniel. It would drain anybody who had seen this kind of vision while they're awake, much less while they're asleep. And he said, Behold, I will make thee know what shall be in the last end of the indignation. For at the time appointed the end shall be. The last end of the indignation. What is this indignation? This indignation is righteous anger against Antiochus and against the Syrians for overwhelming or attempting to overwhelm the people of God and the city of Jerusalem. The ram which thou sawest having 2 horns. are the kings of Media and Persia. So here we find that, yes, the vision which he saw at the beginning of this chapter, that ram represents the Medes and the Persians, who would rise up after the Babylonians. So the Medes and the Persians would rise up, and then that little horn would be, of course, Cyrus, who would be the most prominent ruler among them. And the rough goat is the king of Greece. There's that next world power that rises up after Persia, coming from the west. And the great horn that is between his eyes is the first king. Now, who is the first king of the Grecian Empire? Unquestionably, Alexander. Unquestionably so. Before Alexander the Great, you have a collection of city-states who are fighting among themselves as much as they're fighting against outside powers. But when Alexander comes upon the scene, and I would urge you to read what you can about Alexander the Great's life and his history and the conquest. Alexander was a very interesting character on the world stage. Alexander had had the highest education possible. He was being bred to be a world ruler, not only militarily but diplomatically. Alexander was in a class all by himself. So Alexander proceeds to unite all the city-states of Greece, and that was no mean feat, by the way. He unites all the Greek city-states and then proceeds to turn east. He eventually overcomes Persia in a series of battles, turns south through Palestine, and conquers Egypt, establishing the city of Alexandria. Alexandria, named after him, which has one of the greatest libraries the world has ever seen, unto the point where it's destroyed eventually. And that's a tragedy because there's so much that was there that could have been preserved for history. At any rate, he turns back through Palestine and makes a stop in Jerusalem, but Alexander doesn't touch the temple. He goes into the temple, offending all of the Jews and all of the priests, but then Alexander picks up on the fact that he's done that, so he makes sure that situation is rectified before he leaves, and leaves with goodwill toward the Israelites and gives orders that this temple, this city, not be touched. He then turns his attention toward the eastern sections through what is now Syria, and then goes east further up into what became the Soviet Union, by the way, the southernmost part of the Soviet Union. I believe it's Uzbekistan, possibly, and spends a lot of time in that mountainous region. Eventually, after some very, very protracted battles, conquers that area, turns his attention east again, goes to the very gates of India, to the very Indus River borderline. And it's at the very point, at the height of his power, he's struck down. He dies. And of course, that leaves Greece without a ruler. And thus, it's divided among his four generals, just as Daniel foretells. Verse 22, now that being broken, whereas four stood up for it, 4 kingdoms shall stand up out of the nation, but not in his power. Now, basically, the 4 generals who took control of the empire were Cassander, Lysimachus, Seleucus, and Ptolemy. It's the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, the southern kingdom and the northern kingdom up to the east, that is, Egypt and Syria, if you will, the Ptolemies and Seleucids, that would go back and forth during the time of the Maccabean revolt. One would gain the upper hand, then the other would gain the upper hand. They would try to battle for that eastern section of the old Grecian Empire. Verse 23, and in the latter time of their kingdom, when the transgressors are come to the full, a king of fierce countenance and understanding dark sentences shall stand up. That undoubtedly is Antiochus the fourth Epiphanes. And his power shall be mighty, but not by his own power. Interesting. Antiochus IV Epiphanes would not have this power on his own. It would be given to him. Why? I believe that God used Antiochus to punish his own people. And that he did. And he shall destroy wonderfully, and shall prosper, and practice or do his pleasure, and shall destroy the mighty and the holy people. That's the Jews. So he would wreak havoc while he is in power. And indeed he did. And through his policy also, he shall cause craft to prosper in his hand. And he shall magnify himself in his heart, and by peace or in their security shall destroy many. He shall also stand up against the prince of princes. But he shall be broken without hand. The prince of princes in this context refers to the high priest. And indeed Antiochus did just that. He wanted the high priest to be changed, and he did it. He wanted the daily sacrifice to be taken away, and he did it. He wanted the object of the Jews' worship to be changed, and he did it. He would prosper in that sense. But he shall be broken without hand. So at the very zenith of his power, Antiochus would come down. What we know about Antiochus' death, what little we know, is horrific. Antiochus died a horrible death as a result of his own excesses. A lingering horrible death at that. And when he died with the knowledge that the Israelites had come back into power and had overthrown his yoke. He knew that the Maccabean brothers had successfully shook off the yoke of Syrian oppression. The holiday of Hanukkah that you hear about, Hanukkah is not the Jewish Christmas. Freed Hardeman, they taught us in class. If you put down as an answer to the question, what is Hanukkah? If you put down Jewish Christmas, that's wrong. You'll fail. It's not the Jewish Christmas. Hanukkah is the celebration of the Maccabean revolt. The festival of lights, if you will. And indeed, it was a very momentous occasion. If you read the books of 1st and 2nd Maccabees, which are not inspired of God, they're not part of the Bible, but they're very important historical documents. 1st and 2nd Maccabees describe in detail what took place. Well, before 1st and 2nd Maccabees was ever written, Daniel was talking about it. Daniel is the book that you go to find out about the period between the Old Testament and the New Testament. The so-called silent period. There it was anything but silent. But it's the intertestamental period. And I was very privileged, as I've told you in times past, to sit at the feet of Brother Turner when he taught that very class, the intertestamental period. And much of what he taught us is in this commentary. His notes are also available online if you want to purchase those notes. And it deals in great detail with all the things that I've talked about, in much more detail than I could even start to talk about this morning or in our Sunday morning classes. So, you're talking about a fact that this period of time is significant. And verse 26 then of our chapter says, "The vision of the evening and the morning which was told is true. Wherefore shut thou up the vision, for it shall be for many days." Oh, indeed it would be for many days, because this would play out over 3 centuries. Over a period of about 300 years. That takes us from Daniel's time all the way down to the 1st century. So yes, that vision will be for many days. "And I, Daniel," verse 27, "fainted and was sick." I laugh about it, but I mean, wouldn't you be? He said, "I was sick certain days." What an experience to go through for anybody, but especially an older man who has shown this vision in just one thing after another, and it just overwhelms him. Afterward, I rose up and did the king's business. Goes to work. How do I deal with this? Go to work. So he goes to work. And I was astonished at the vision, but none understood it. Apparently, Daniel told a few people about the vision he'd had. Nobody understood it. Daniel didn't completely understand it. Even though he was told what these animals represented, he didn't fully grasp the meaning of this vision. So he's just perplexed. What does this mean? What does this signify? Well, he's going to have a good period of time to ponder about that thing, because we're going to see described next, as we resume our study next week, something that you have often been taught over the years, and a significant event it was. We're going to go back to Daniel chapter 5 next week. Remember, it's out of sequence in the way the book is organized, but we're going in chronological order. We started in chapter 7, the first year of Belshazzar. Chapter 8, the third year of Belshazzar. Chapter 5, we're going to be talking about the last days of Belshazzar. So chronologically, it makes sense. So next Sunday morning, we're going to be talking about Belshazzar, and the handwriting is on the wall. Have you ever heard that phrase? The writings upon the wall. It comes straight from Daniel chapter 5. Remember that great hand that wrote? Well, we'll talk about that next Sunday morning.